Good evening. Schools all across the state, including the North Country, subject to different threats. Before the weekend and into the weekend, local law enforcement calling these threats non-credible. Tonight, 7 News reporter Thomas Caffarella listens to school leaders and learns how they do keep students safe and also how police are paying attention.
A new school year brings back familiar fears for Jefferson Lewis BOCES Superintendent Stephen Todd.
At various points in the 90s, rashes of people calling into schools with bomb threats, which would cause great concern.
Threats of violence at schools across the state and in the North Country. Shooting threats were made on Friday the 13th and over the weekend, warning about Monday. Some local police took to social media to say the threats they investigated were non-credible. Todd says to remain vigilant, but fear shouldn't consume students or parents.
We all want to continually emphasize the importance of say something if you see something, but by the same token, we want everybody to be able to live their lives and we want our children to be happy and not anxious.
Schools take threats of violence seriously. Law enforcement does too.
Once law enforcement catches you, and we will, our intelligence centers and our techniques are getting better and better. And we will identify you. And once we do, I say we lay the hammer down.
Barnett says a person can be charged with aggravated harassment or making a terroristic threat. While it could be a felony charge, the sheriff thinks the consequences should be higher.
I wish they would let myself and a group of sheriffs write the laws and these statutes, because things would be a lot different.
Barnett says it costs taxpayers to determine the fact and fiction of school threats. But above all, he says these threats interfere with the student's ability to get an education in a safe environment. Thomas Caffarella, 7 News.